Okay, so what we're going to be working with today is some basics in animation. Let's just create our file scene first, and then we can go into some animating. So I'm just going to put a floor in here, just by hitting the floor tool right up there in the palette. I'm going to grab a sphere, okay, and I'm going to raise the sphere up 100 centimeters so that it's sitting right directly on the floor, okay? Pretty easy. And this is going to be our character that we're going to animate here. And in order for us to see a little bit what's going on in the scene, I think it's going to be helpful to create a material that that will show the movement a little better. So I'm just going to bring in a new material, and then under the color and texture here, I'm going to bring in the surface, and just go down to surface and then up to checkerboard. Okay. And it'll be a little bit easier to see the movement with the checkerboard surface. And of course, if you want to, you can change the color. Maybe I'll make this guy a nice yellow. This will be like a bumblebee, rolling bumblebee. Okay, so take your material, drop it on here, and the final thing is let's just pop in a light, and I'm going to go to above here so I can see a little bit better. I'm going to bring this up and over this way. That's pretty good. And then for the shadow, let's just do a soft shadow at about 80%. Okay? So this is what I want everyone to have for their scene file. Okay? A floor, a basic sphere with a checkerboard pattern on there, a light with some soft shadow so that everyone's file is going to look something like this. Okay? And we're all going to do different types of animation for our final project for this part of it. But this is essentially where we're at with what our file is going to look like. Okay, so the first thing we want to think about, since we've been doing a lot of modeling, we want to switch our palette a little bit just so we can animate, and it'll provide a little bit more easier flow. Okay, so the first thing is over on the left side, the model tool or the object tool. You just want to click and hold this down and grab object. You see a little film strip there? It's a little icon to indicate that we're going to be animating at this point. So you want to change from the model mode to the object mode. Okay, so just change to that. So that little film strip gets highlighted. And then down below we have this timeline. If we hit play, nothing's happening, but we see the little green bar going across all of those frames. At any time you can go back and forth. You know, this is the back button to 0. This is the forward button to the end of the timeline that you have. And you can always change the frame rate if you want. So if you add frames, for example here, it's 90 frames as default. And for our purposes, we're going to be working with 30 frames per second. So 90 frames is 3 seconds. Okay. You know, you could change this to 180, and that would be 6 seconds. It's only going to play along the timeline that this bar shows. So if I stretch this out, then it'll play the entire thing, 180. Okay. If I shrink it down to 90, roughly 90, there we go, then it'll only play to 90 and then go back to 0. All right. So if you add frames and you don't see all of the frames, just check down below to see that this is stretched out all the way. But for our purposes, 90 frames is probably sufficient for what we're doing. Okay, the other thing I wanted to note was that you know, whenever you're animating, you need to have selected in the objects palette whatever you want to animate. So you know, that's pretty obvious, but sometimes that can, you know, be confusing. So just make sure the sphere is selected so we can see it, and then it will record the keyframes that we apply to it on that individual object. All right, so the first thing I want to do is we're going to animate the position. All right, you can animate, an easy one to think about is you can animate the position, you can animate the scale, and you can animate the rotation, and then a number of other things beyond that. Anytime, whenever you're in the Attributes Manager, if you see these little dots along here, these indicate areas that can be animated. So you could animate the radius, the segments, you could render all of these things. So whenever you're working, even in materials, if you open up a material and you see those little dots along here, you can animate the color, the texture, the reflection. You know, so anything, when you're going through, you know, modeling and working with software, check out to see anything that has this little dot next to it means it can be animated. All right. So if you ever have questions about that, just let me know. But it's pretty cool. So you could change the color and have that be a part of the animation. You could add reflection suddenly to an object, and that could be animated. So there's a lot of different things that can happen. But again, anything that has a little dot next to it can be animated. All right, so what we're going to do now is just change the position. So right now I'm at 0, 100, and 0, essentially centered at 0, 0. I'm just going to move this back in space along the z-axis to about 360 centimeters. And that's going to be our starting point. I'm going to make sure the keyframe is zeroed out at the beginning of the frame. And then these are the three buttons that we're going to be using. The first one is just the manual keyframe button. So when you click this, what you'll see is a little tiny blue square that gets highlighted underneath the 0 frame. That indicates that a keyframe has been set at that position. And whenever you drop a keyframe in, it's going to record the position, the rotation, and the scale, all three of those things simultaneously. Okay? In order to create movement, then, we need to move forward in the timeline first. So here I'm just going to click all the way to the end to 90 frames, and then do something to the object, and then click another keyframe. Okay, so in this case, I'm going to move this along the z-axis forward to, let's say, negative 360. Okay, and then click the keyframe button again, and you'll notice what happens, that you get a path, and this indicates that there's some animation that's been applied. Every little tiny dot that you see along here is essentially a frame. Okay, so there's 90 little dots along this line that indicate the 90 frames that we've created along the timeline. Okay, and so far they're fairly equally spaced, meaning that there's going to be kind of an even motion. If you click play, you can see that it goes across kind of an even speed or motion. So that's the base. That's the basics of kind of laying out this animation. So we can anything we can sort of move around. You'll see the path that you create, and you can sort of change the position along the way. All right, I'm just going to pause for a second. All right, so from here I just want to animate the rotation. So again, at 0 I already have my position, scale, and rotation set. So all I need to do is go to the end, to 90, and here what I want to do is click the rotation tool, and I kind of want to have it rotate along the x-axis. Okay, so what I tend to like to do is just kind of move this a little bit, and then do you see the numbers down below, going up and down? That tells me what I need to change in order to get a rotation there. So for this, I just want to, instead of having it's 0, I want to change this to 360. Okay, that means that the ball is going to make an entire rotation, 360-degree rotation, from 0 keyframe to 90 keyframe. So type in 360, hit apply, and then click on the keyframe button. Okay, and then now what we'll have is a rotation along that movement. Okay, so now we've keyed the position, and we had also keyed the rotation, and now we get the illusion of that ball kind of rolling across the timeline. Also, when the animation is going, you can kind of move the camera around too to see at different positions how you want it to look, etc. So that's kind of a nice thing about the editor view. You can kind of do things while the animation is moving. Okay, next, what I want to do is have this thing kind of inflate a little bit and then deflate along that motion. So now we're going to animate the position, or the scale rather. So here what I'm going to do is just go to roughly about 45. I'm going to change to the scale tool, and I'm going to enlarge this just a little bit. Actually, I'm going to enlarge it 400 along the X, Y, and Z. Okay, and just hit apply, and then it kind of, notice that it goes into the floor. I don't really want it to do that, so I'm also going to change the position a little bit here. I'm just going to click on the position tool, and then I'm going to move this up instead of 100 to 200. Hit apply, and then hit the keyframe. And then now what we'll have is this ball that is rolling along that space, growing and then shrinking down. Okay, so here we have animated the position, the scale, and the rotation, all three of those things together. So if you can imagine any kind of combination of those elements, you can create all kinds of different types of movements within objects. Now the other thing that I wanted to point out, if you go up to Window and click on Timeline, here you can see the synopsis of all those frames. If we open up the sphere, you'll see the position, the scale, and the rotation, and where those keys are placed along this. Now the cool thing is as this is moving along, if you click on summary, and actually if we just click all of the end keyframes, you can actually move this. Okay, so if we change it from moving it from 90, let's say, to 75, it's going to change. Just close this out. It's going to change the speed of our rotation. Notice how it goes slow and then it speeds up at the end, right? Because it's trying to condense all of those keyframes down that we've created into a smaller scale. Notice also that there are when you look at the timeline here in the editor, the dots are really close together, and then at the end they're kind of far apart. So we're changing the motion of that along the way. You can also do that here. You can just simply grab the keyframe and you can move it. Notice how the dots are changing, right? They're changing along this sort of timeline. So if I move this to 50, it's really going to change the way that this moves. It's going to go slow and then really fast. Okay? So once you have keyframes set down, they're not set in stone. You can move them around. You can change them within place. You can also change the path. So if we notice these little keys, these are those keyframes that we've laid in. You can actually take those and move them. So if you grab one, you can move it. Right? So if I stretch this over to the right, now it's going to kind of go in a little bit of an arc. So when I play this, now it's going to go here, and then it's going to rotate over to the side. So it's kind of changing its position along the way. So there's a lot of manipulations you can do once you have the basic animation set. So you can kind of play around with those different elements to change the form. Okay, so project number one for your animation is to take this sphere and using that basic idea of keyframing, do something interesting to it. You can have, well, let's keep it to 90 frames. So just do 90 frame animation. See what you can make that ball do. Have it go crazy, bounce around, move a bunch of times, whatever. Create some sort of basic animation using a single sphere in this basic scene and playing around with those manual keyframes. All right, so that's the first part of the project. All right, so let's say we want to get rid of all of this animation, right? We played around with it a little bit, but we're not happy with it. We want to start over from scratch. What you can do is just go to the timeline again, up to Window, down to Timeline. Just click on Summary and just hit Delete, and all of those keyframes will go away. Okay? And here you can see if I hit play, then nothing happens. All the keyframes down below are gone, and you can really, you can start over again. So for our purposes, that makes it pretty easy. The other thing I wanted to talk a little bit about, so there's two parts of the project. One is just to do some manual keyframing, playing around with position, scale, and rotation. The second part of it is I want you to take this sphere and to play around with some deformers. Okay? So let's set this back to 0. I'm going to put this at 0x and 0z. The y is going to be 100 again. I'll kind of zoom in a little bit here so we can see better. And just grab a deformer. Maybe let's just start with the bulge because that's a pretty easy one to do. The bulge deformer can be animated as well. So if we take the bulge and I'm gonna move it up a little bit here so it's more centered over that guy, and then drop it on my sphere. So notice down in the Attributes Manager, all of these little things, the size, the mode, the strength, the curvature, all of those things have a little dot next to them, meaning that they can be animated. Now I find that when you're working with animating in the Attributes Manager, when you're animating beyond simple things like the scale, the size, and the position, it's helpful to just use the Auto Keyframe tool. Okay? And that tool is just right here. This little button that looks like a little circular recycle kind of sign is the Auto Keyframe button. Just click that and notice what happens. Your editor screen gets the red kind of icon around it, this sort of red frame, letting you know that the Auto Keyframe is ready to record anything that you do. Okay? So anytime you make a change in the scene, when you move forward in the timeline, it's going to record a key. So the first thing that I like to do is just click the manual keyframe button just to drop in our 0 keyframe. All right? And then if we move forward along the timeline, let's again move to like 45, let's say. And then notice how right now this is highlighted right here. The strength is highlighted because I have it highlighted in my scene. So when I grab this and move it, what's going to happen is it's going to pop in a little keyframe. So when I did something different to the object, it's going to pop in that keyframe automatically. Okay? And so this is really, really helpful when you're starting to work. The thing you want to be careful with this is when you start clicking between objects, make sure you turn off the auto keyframe button. Because sometimes that happens when you're working with an object and then you say, oh wait, I want to change the position of the floor, and then you keep clicking, and to do that it's going to record that position and you'll animate those other objects. So just remember that when you're working with the auto keyframing tool, make sure you turn it off when you're going to work with other objects in the scene. The other thing is, in the Attributes Manager, notice there's a little red dot here now. So that indicates that something has been animated along, a keyframe has been added for that particular element. Okay, so I've inflated it a little bit. I'm going to go to 70, and then I'm going to go the opposite way. You can manually put this in too. So if I just type in like -80, for example, hit enter, it's going to squish it down, and it's going to record a keyframe there. And then at the end, I'm just going to bring this back to 0, and click auto keyframe off. Go back to 0 and just play it out and see what happens. So here we have an animated sort of ball inflating and deflating along the sort of timeline. And again, you know, with this, you can play around with the position of those keyframes. You know, if I speed this up to 20, for example, I'll have a different type of movement, slower kind of movement. So again, along that timeline, you always have the flexibility of kind of changing those keys around to record different types of movements. Okay, so project 1 is using the manual keyframe buttons, you know, scale, position, rotation. Project 2 is using some deformers. And again, each project, 90 frames, and all we need to do is just 2 different separate files, 2 different separate movies. Okay, the last thing is, let's talk about, once we're finished and we're happy with the project, let's talk about how to render it out to a QuickTime movie. That's what the final output is going to be. Okay, so we're set with our scene. We're really happy with it. If you want to do a preview, you can always do a preview. Now, a preview is not going to be the final animation that you make, but if you want to see what it looks like, you can always go up to Render and Make Preview. Okay, this is sort of the quick and easy way to do this. It's just going to give you the default size, 320 by 240 at 30 frames per second. If you just hit OK, it's going to calculate it out. It just takes a little bit. I mean, depending upon your you know, the information that you have there. And then it'll give you a view of this in the picture viewer, and you can preview it. So again, this is kind of a, you know, low-res version of what we're going to be making, but it kind of gives you a quick preview. So you can preview it before you render it out as the final QuickTime. All right, so if we're happy with that, let's go to our render settings. Click on Render Settings. First thing is Output. For our purposes, I think we'll just choose, actually let's first go to, I think 16 by 9 is much more attractive, the HD sort of view. So if we do 16 by 9, and then if we just change the width to like 480, that's probably pretty good. Oh, I gotta lock my ratio here. 16 by 9. Lock ratio, 480 by 270. That's a pretty good size to work with for our output. And then, so you know, set up your custom settings here, your settings, and then this default is current frame, so that's just going to render one frame, whatever frame you're on. You want to make sure here that you have all frames, because we're going to be recording a movie here, so we want all the frames to render. Okay. And you know, the other thing too about this, when you have all frames, you can always type in manually. So if you only wanted the first 30 frames to render, you could just, you know, type in 30. So at any time, if you want to, you know, change the rate, you can do that. And that's pretty much it. Oh, save. So I'm just going to save this to my 3D animation. I have a folder set in my movies file, and I'm just going to call this ball deform. That's fine. Okay, and then so have a place for it. For format, what we want is QuickTime Movie. Okay, and for our compression, if you go to Options, the best compression for our purposes is going to be H.264. Keeps the quality pretty high, but it makes it a smaller file, so that'll be good for dropping on our shared drive. Hit OK. We don't need sound, so you can click that off. And that's pretty much it. Close that out. Click on Render to the Picture Viewer. Notice that it's going to generate all those frames. It gives you individual frames in the picture viewer. And then once it's finished, you can simply find your file, movies, animation, folder form, and play it out. Okay? So it's pretty easy. 2 files for Thursday. One using manual keyframes, the other using deformers and auto keyframing. And let's see what we can do.